What would you do if, on a freezing morning, nature itself came to your door asking for help? That early morning, Lucas Grant woke with a start. The silence outside felt strange, as if the world was on pause. He put on his thickest coat and walked to the old thermometer next to the door. The needle read -60 degrees Celsius. It was the lowest temperature recorded in that part of the Yukon in more than 50 years. The air was not just cold, it was deadly. Every tree branch was covered in a sharp, cutting layer of ice, and even the metal fence looked like frozen glass. Lucas had grown up there, used to severe winters, but he had never felt the cold as such a present enemy. He tried to warm himself with a steaming mug of coffee, but the sharp whistle of the wind began to overpower the crackling of the fireplace. He stepped closer to the window and saw snow being lifted into tall swirling columns, dancing like living towers in the yard. For a moment he was hypnotized until something different moved at the edge of his vision. First, a pair of amber eyes glowed in the storm. The shape emerged, a female bobcat, her fur covered in snow and ice, her body shaking violently. Behind her, almost invisible against the white, 3 tiny cubs struggled to stay upright. The smallest stumbled, collapsed into the snow and lay still, its chest rising and falling so faintly that Lucas felt a deep ache that had nothing to do with the cold. The mother stepped forward, gripping the fragile cub by the scruff of its neck. She pressed it against the glass, leaving a circle of fog with her breath. Then she lifted her gaze to him, a gaze that did not just ask, it pleaded. The wind threw snow hard against the walls, but Lucas no longer heard anything. He saw only those eyes and the tiny trembling body. In that instant, he knew that, if he did not act, that life had only minutes left. Lucas stood still for a few seconds, his heart pounding. Instinct told him not to open the door to a wild animal, but the image of that cub barely clinging to life was impossible to ignore. He took a deep breath, set down his coffee mug, and moved toward the entrance. The wood of the door was so cold it felt like it burned his skin through the gloves. With trembling hands, he turned the handle and opened only a small gap. The icy air rushed in like a blade, cutting his face and making his eyes water. What happened next left him speechless. The mother did not retreat or growl. With surprising care, she placed the cub at the opening and took 2 steps back, as if to show she posed no threat. Lucas knelt down. As he lifted the small body, he felt how light it was, almost without warmth, as if he were holding a handful of snow. He moved quickly inside and closed the door to stop more cold from coming in. He placed the cub on a blanket near the fireplace, wrapping it gently. Turning around, he saw the mother still by the door, her gaze fixed on him. Then she looked toward the other 2 cubs, cold against the wind. Lucas understood immediately what she was telling him without making a sound. He opened the door again, this time with more confidence, and gestured for her to come closer. The mother moved forward, nudging the 2nd cub, and then the 3rd into the house. The man shut the door and for a moment simply looked at the small lives lying on the wooden floor, their breathing still and even. The mother remained at the entrance, hesitant, as if asking for permission. Lucas looked at her, noticing the layers of ice clinging to her fur and the weight of exhaustion in her body. He stepped back and spoke in a low, calm tone, "Come in." "It's all right." She moved forward cautiously, shaking her body and releasing small shards of ice that sparkled in the air before falling to the floor. Then she went to her cubs and lay beside them, wrapping them with her body in silent protection. The room filled with a different kind of warmth, not from the fireplace, but from an unlikely meeting between 2 worlds that rarely touch. Lucas did not waste time. He ran to the cabinet where he kept blankets and took out every single one he could find. He folded them and stacked them near the fireplace, creating a deep and cozy space. The mother watched each movement closely, her eyes fixed on him as if evaluating every gesture before deciding whether to fully trust. When he finished, he made a small hand gesture for her to come closer. Her instinct was clear. She first pushed the cubs, one by one, toward the new nest of warmth. Then she settled beside them, arranging the blankets with her nose and paws until they were fully covered. A low, rough purr escaped her, mixed with heavy breathing. The heat from the fireplace began to bring life back to the little ones. The weakest, who minutes earlier could barely move, let out a faint, almost imperceptible mew. Lucas felt a lump in his throat. It was the first sign that there might still be hope. He sat on the floor, watching them, feeling his face warm, just from the fire but from something deeper. The storm outside did not ease. The wind howled against the walls and snow piled quickly against the windows, but inside the house the atmosphere was different. There was a silence heavy with meaning, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of the animals breathing. The mother, despite her visible exhaustion, did not close her eyes. She stayed alert, head raised, ready to react to any sign of danger. Lucas respected her space. He did not try to touch the cubs or come closer than necessary. He simply stayed there, present, sharing that improbable moment. Seeing him still and calm, the female seemed to relax slightly. Her body, once tense, settled more comfortably on the blankets, and her gaze lost some of its initial hardness. It was as if, for the first time, she admitted that this man posed no threat. Lucas, in turn, realized he was witnessing something rare, the cautious surrender of a wild animal to the care of a human. Hours passed without the wind showing any sign of easing. Snow now covered nearly half the windows, and the sound outside resembled the constant roar of a giant animal. Lucas remained seated near the fireplace, watching every movement of the mother and her cubs without interfering. Then he noticed something different in her behavior. The female rose slowly, stretching her body with the elegance of a wild feline. She took a few steps toward the kitchen and stopped at the edge between the living room and the counter, turning her head to look at him. Her ears were slightly raised, her body leaning forward, but there was no threat in the gesture. On the contrary, it seemed like a silent question. Lucas frowned, trying to interpret that look. The answer came to him almost instinctively. He stood up, opened the refrigerator, and took out a piece of raw meat. He placed it on a small plate and approached slowly. He set the plate on the floor halfway between them. The female stepped forward, sniffed the food cautiously, and then picked it up delicately with her mouth. Instead of eating, she returned to the nest and divided the meat into small pieces, offering them to the cubs one by one. Lucas watched in silence, impressed by the precision and care with which she fed the little ones. With each piece shared, the trust between them seemed to grow. When she finished feeding the cubs, the mother looked back at him for a few seconds, as if to acknowledge the gesture. There were no words, but the message was clear. Outside, the storm continued, snow piling against the walls like a white and impenetrable barrier. Inside the house, however, the firelight illuminated the scene with a soft glow, as if that moment were protected from the outside world. Lucas realized that, in some way, this wild family had found in him not only shelter, but also an unlikely ally. The storm seemed endless. The wind blew with enough force to make the walls creak, and the sound of snow against the windows was like thousands of tiny grains of sand hurled with violence. The warmth of the fireplace, however, kept the inside of the house a safe refuge, and Lucas felt that the space had become much more than just physical shelter. The cubs, once motionless and fragile, were beginning to show clear signs of recovery. One of them tried to stand and take a few hesitant steps on the blankets. The smallest, the one Lucas had feared might not survive, nestled even closer to the mother, but was now breathing more steadily. He watched every movement, feeling a mix of relief and fascination. The mother kept her gaze divided between her young and Lucas. There was no hostility, only attentive vigilance. With each passing hour, that invisible barrier seemed to give way a little. Lucas, respecting that space, did not come closer than necessary, but stayed always within her line of sight. As if to prove he was fully present, time passed in a strange way. Outside, the world was frozen under snow and cold, but inside, small gestures gave rhythm to the night. The crackle of the fire, the shifting of blankets by the mother, the soft sounds of the cubs changing position. Lucas began to realize that he was witnessing not just a moment of survival, but a silent and deep bond taking shape. When the fireplace needed more wood, he rose slowly, wary of breaking the harmony. The mother followed his every step, but did not move to block him. On the contrary, she stayed calm, as if she already knew he posed no threat. Lucas fed the fire and returned to sit down, feeling that somehow this newly formed trust was as precious as the very life he was protecting. The night moved forward slowly, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Gusts of wind made the roof groan, and the snow piled so high it began to completely block the view from the windows. Lucas felt the isolation growing, but also a strange serenity in that small space where warmth and life endured. Around midnight, he noticed a different movement. The mother rose carefully, leaving the cubs nestled in the blankets. She walked to one corner of the room and stopped, turning her body to face him directly. There was no rush in her movements, only intent. Lucas interpreted it as another test of the trust between them. He decided to stay still, allowing her to choose the next step. After a few seconds, the female returned to the cubs and lay down again, making sure they were all warm. Lucas noticed that, even in her exhaustion, she stayed alert to every sound coming from outside. Time seemed to merge with the constant sound of the wind. Lucas thought about how improbable the situation was. A wild animal, which in nature would rarely allow a human to get close, now shared the warmth of his home and trusted him to protect her young. On a quiet impulse, he extended his hand, but kept it at a safe distance. He did not want to force anything. The mother, perhaps sensing the gesture, simply watched him without moving. There was a mutual understanding. Each respected the other's territory. The following hours passed without incident, only with the calm presence of everyone in that shared space. The fire stayed alive, and Lucas realized that, for the first time that night, the initial tension was beginning to give way to something deeper, something close to respect and admiration between species that, until then, had only known each other as opposites in instinct. Dawn arrived almost without Lucas noticing. Pale light filtered through the curtains, blending with the warm glow of the fireplace. Outside, the storm had finally lost its strength. The wind no longer roared with the same fury, and snow now fell gently, as if the world outside had decided to rest. The change in the weather seemed to awaken the mother. She rose slowly, stretching her body before checking each cub with a delicate touch of her nose. The little ones responded with livelier movements than the night before. Lucas felt a wave of satisfaction as he realized that in just a few hours they had regained some of their lost energy. The female moved to the door and stopped. She stood there for a moment, watching the outside carefully. Lucas understood what it meant. She was preparing to return to her territory. The thought brought a tightness to his chest. Before opening the door, he knelt at a safe distance. He did not want to rush anything, but he also did not want them to leave without one last moment of connection. The mother turned her head toward him and held his gaze for a few seconds. There was no fear or tension, only a silent clarity that seemed to say she knew exactly what he had done for them. Lucas stood and, with a calm gesture, opened the door. The cold air rushed in immediately, bringing with it the scent of snow and forest. The mother remained still for a few moments, as if weighing the difference between the warmth she was leaving behind and the frozen world waiting for her. Finally, she stepped outside, her paws sinking into the soft snow. The cubs followed, hesitant but determined. Lucas stayed at the doorway, watching each step, engraving that image in his memory. He knew that once they disappeared into the whiteness of the landscape, only silence would remain, along with a deep mark on his life. The mother's paws carved perfect trails in the soft snow, and the cubs followed them with short steps, sinking with each movement. The whiteness of the landscape was so intense that, for a moment, Lucas almost lost sight of the small shapes. Only their tails, rising and falling rhythmically, revealed their passage. At one point, the mother stopped and turned her head toward him. The gesture was brief, but enough for Lucas to feel that it was a silent farewell. There were no words, only an acknowledgement that crossed the distance and the cold. He stood motionless at the doorway, his body filled with a mix of pride and melancholy. Pride for having been able to help, melancholy for knowing that this chapter was closing. Snow continued to fall, painting white over a scene that already seemed made of pure ice. The cubs, protected by their mother's size, stayed close, moving with the confidence of those following a sure guide. Lucas understood that this instinct to protect never faded, and that out there, survival depended on constant vigilance. When they finally disappeared among the trees, a deep silence took over the space. It was not the heavy silence of the storm, but a clean silence that seemed to bring peace. Lucas closed the door slowly, as if not wanting to cut the last invisible thread connecting him to them. Standing in the center of the room, he let the warmth of the fireplace surround him. The smell of burnt wood mixed with the cold air that still lingered in the space. He knew he would keep that moment forever, not just for the story itself, but for what it had taught him about trust, respect, and the unexpected connection between worlds that rarely meet. In the days that followed, Lucas could not stop thinking about the mother and her cubs. Whenever he went out to gather firewood or clear the entrance, he found fresh tracks in the snow, some large and others small, disappearing into the forest. He knew it was no coincidence. They were still nearby. One morning, when he opened the door to check the yard, he found the remains of a wild rabbit on the snow. There were no signs of struggle, only the huff left from the meal. To Lucas, that gesture was not just animal instinct. It felt like a kind of silent offering, a way of acknowledging what he had done. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest as he picked it up, and for the rest of the day, the image of the lynx's mother leaving the prey at his door stayed in his mind. He did not know he would see them up close again, but he no longer needed to. The simple fact of knowing they were alive and remembered him was enough. At night, sitting by the fireplace, he recalled every detail of those intense hours. The biting cold, the mother's pleading gaze, the fragility of the cubs, and the way they had survived against all odds. He thought about how instinct, both human and animal, could create unlikely bridges in moments of extreme need. Outside, winter continued, covering everything with successive layers of snow. But inside that house, there was something the cold could not erase, the memory of an unlikely encounter that had changed the way he saw the wild world. And deep down, Lucas knew that whenever he felt the icy wind blowing, he would remember those amber eyes that once asked him for help. Weeks later, Lucas's life had returned to its usual rhythm. Even so, every time the icy wind whistled against the walls, he remembered that morning when the door opened to a plea for help from the heart of nature. One afternoon, while stacking firewood on the porch, a movement at the edge of the forest caught his attention. Between the shadows of the trees, the unmistakable silhouette of a lynx appeared. The mother was there, watching him from a distance. She did not come closer, but she did not retreat either. Beside her, 3 smaller shapes moved with restrained curiosity. The cubs had grown, their fur thicker, and their movements more confident. Lucas stayed still, afraid to break the moment. The mother remained for a few seconds, as if to show him they were well. Then she turned slowly and disappeared into the trees, taking the little ones with her. He stood there, looking at the empty space where they had been, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. That brief appearance was enough to confirm that the bond formed on that frozen night had not disappeared. It was not a bond of possession or domestication, but of recognition and respect. That night, sitting by the fireplace, Lucas thought about what he had learned. He understood that sometimes the boundaries between the human world and the wild fade when there is empathy and the courage to act, and that even when contact is brief, its impact can last forever. When he turned off the lights and looked out the window, the snow reflected the moonlight, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Lucas smiled, certain that somewhere out there, amber eyes were watching the same sky, and that certainty was enough for him. If this story touched your heart, don't miss the next one. Subscribe now and join us for more emotional moments between humans and animals. Your support helps us share more stories of courage, love, and hope.